That's a load of science.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of That's a Lot of Science, the podcast for science lover and enthusiastic people. Today, we are going to have a very interesting topic to discuss, which is the clinical trial sector, and in particular, how the technology is changing the game of clinical trials. We are in the phase of a big changing in the world of clinical trials, and we are going to talk this with Karina, which is our guest today. She has a huge experience, over 15 years of experience in pharma and biotech, about manufacturing, quality assurance, clinical ops, IT development operation. She is also teaching these overseas, and she is then the best person to talk about this with us today. And I welcome you, Karina. First of all, thank you very much for being with us today. And as we always start, I like to leave the stage to you to introduce yourself, to tell a little bit about yourself, what you're doing now, what you're up to, and then we start digging into the topic of the day. So please, Karina.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on Loads of Science. I'm really excited to talk, obviously, about the technology and how it's impacting the drug development space in biotech, specifically, of course, in the ClinOps space, because I've been particularly interested in this space for a couple of years now, obviously, specifically searching roles in those areas. But I started out my journey originally doing a gap year. I was pre-law. And I actually was working for a company called Roche Diagnostic at the time. And I remember one of the mentors there was asking me, like, why are you going to law school? And I was like, well, I want to obviously, help argue the right side of the law, as I told her. And she says, well, you go into an area called quality assurance, and you're always going to be arguing on the right side of law, advocating for the right side of law. And so I actually looked into this, and that's how I actually got my first job in quality assurance. In quality assurance, we obviously are in the business of compliance, making sure that operations work as they say, per the regulation, per our procedures as well too. And so from there on out, I've always been very interested in operations. How do things come together? How are things really carried out as we promise per our regulations, per our guidelines, per our procedures we have in place? And so from there on out, I've actually moved into other departments seeking that understanding of how things come together in operations. And while I actually was in manufacturing, it was first there that we were able to bring on a technology very early on. This is probably about 10 plus years ago, where we launched a learning management system. It's a legacy system by a vendor called IsoTrain. But it showed us very clearly how operational efficiency could be brought in with a tool like this. You engage stakeholders, you can increase compliance, you can increase operation. And from there on, I was hooked. And so then I moved very quickly into other roles to have a better understanding of how technology, and when I say technology, tools, technology can impact systems as well too in other departments. And now currently, I'm the founder of my own consulting company called AKA Management Group, where I help companies them launch and implement strategic systems end to end, so that we ensure that the systems are built to fit, they're built to scale, and they're built to last. That way too, we make sure that the people, the process, the tools, technology all work together.
Yeah, I mean, very interesting. I mean, already you can see already how many different things you have been through, and like all the experience that you carry with you. And this is definitely going to help with your new company, and that would be amazing. A personal question before we move into the topic of clinical trial: how did you find moving from so different sectors, like from manufacturing to QA, ClinOps, and then we will start talking into clinical trials? But I found myself, I mean, I've been changing roles and changing areas during my career, but this has always been a sort of a challenge for me, like, getting used to new practice, new way of thinking. How it was for you, like changing these fields and this area, but still maintaining the idea of like, operational and efficiency.
Right. You're right. I would say like it brings unique challenges because you actually have to be able to speak the language of that particular department. And so for someone like myself that originally sat in quality assurance, right, to move into manufacturing, that itself initially was a little bit challenging too, because again, there is a generalization here when I speak to this, but generally manufacturing is predominantly male, right? And so as a female entering the space, the conversations, the relationship building, the way you even communicate is different, right? And so there is understanding, first of all, the operations, the communication, the leadership style, but also at the end of the day, right? You got to understand that we are all working together to bring together a drug that is able to potentially provide hope, provide another chance, right, for the patient itself, right, and for the family itself too. So that's one thing that I've always stressed, that we're all working together. There are differences, but at the end of the day, we're actually more similar than we're actually different. And again, this is the same strategy I used when I had moved over to ClinOps. ClinOps, again, is very different from manufacturing. Again, I am generalizing here, but the communication is very different as well in ClinOps. And definitely the same tactic, which I have to also learn the communication style. You got to also learn what matters in certain departments. Like, for example, IT is very different from, say, a ClinOps department. IT is mostly technical, and ClinOps is more in the business of engaging patients, making sure the trials are executed properly. And so it's different goals, different, I would say, a different focus, but at the end of the day, still, we're working together in the drug development process, right, to bring those drugs to the patients themselves.
Yeah, exactly. It is all about that. Yeah, and in clinical operation, as you said, we also have a different language with other, sectors. Like you mentioned IT, but I think we work for manufacturing with any other sector, because you always have to deal with with people that are anyhow, affected by a condition or a disease. So you must also, keep that in mind when you develop the communication skill. And that is a big problem, I feel, sometimes, because in pharma, some people, they do not cultivate their, empathies and language skill. And when it comes to clinical operation in particular, when we have to talk with, you said, hope for people, hope for patients, but also for the family, that can become a problem. Now, we have seen that, my opinion, during the last, pandemic, that I think there was a sort of a detachment from what was actually being done from the pharma to go through this, period that we hopefully is behind our back, and what the people, like the average man, would understand about that, and how they would welcome these sort of things. And how do you face this in your career? How it was for you? I mean, did you have ever to face these kind of things, or or like, if you didn't, like, how would you improve the communication, for example, in our world, in the pharma world?
Yeah, I think what you touch on is so key, because a lot of times we're in, I want to say, it's true. There is truth in this. When you're in a certain department, right, there is some silo in there, because, for example, if you're in ClinOps, you're focused on trial execution, right? If you're in IT, you're focused on IT infrastructure, maintaining the hardware, a lot of the SaaS software right now too. So you're focused on your roadmap, your department goals. And so you're removed from a lot of times the end goal, right? And I've heard at several different companies, you have the CEOs or CMO talk about driving for the patients, right? And so that itself, it seems sometimes like, it's the rallying mission, but when you're in the thick of things, sometimes too, you forget that. But I think it's so important to remember how our work in regards to every department, it ultimately impacts that mission, which is driving for the patient and their family. And so I think one of the communications that we need to emphasize that, to a lot of us working across these different departments, that we're all in this together. We all bring our expertise together. Yes, we might communicate maybe in a different style. Like, for example, some departments tend to be a little bit more introverted, right? Again, this is just a general statement, but this is based on my own experience. QA in general tends to be a little bit more introverted, right? Manufacturing and ClinOps tend to be a little bit more extroverted. IT a little bit more introvert. But those communication styles are all part of the whole entire drug development process, right? People are different, but people are the same, because we're all driving towards a common goal, driving for delivering in our own areas, right? And I think so. One of the things I feel like has been the key to my success, being able to move across so many different departments, is understanding that, respecting the fact that we all come together to work on something that's, ultimately mission critical. I told people, we're not working on developing, like, I don't know, a food product. Not to say that's not amazing, right? Like the new flavor of, say, like a carrot cake or a chocolate cake. Not to say that's not amazing, right? Or developing an app, right? That you can download. Not to say that's not amazing itself, but what we really get to do in our industry is delivering value by providing a drug that is not maybe available in the marketplace. No, I'll share a personal story here. I actually had a very close family member that, thankfully, she's now in remission, but she was given, a standard care of medication. These are, some of the top drugs by, like, Genentech or Eli Lilly. Again, I'm not necessarily advertising these particular companies, but a lot of the standard of care of medication are provided through some of these, these big companies right now. And she was obviously able to treat it on a standard care, right, as normal chemotherapy, and she's in remission now. And we had also a family member 20 years ago that had the same diagnosis as her, okay, that passed away because those medicines weren't available 20 years ago. Yeah. You think about that. That's incredible in terms of, like, what's available today and what's going to be available in years to come, because you now are, I feel like we're at the cusp of a lot of efficiencies, because we are now in the era of automation, AI. There's a lot more technology that just wasn't available even just 10 years ago because of the costs of bringing these, technology forward.
Absolutely. And I mean, thanks, Karina, for sharing this story with us. And you're right. I mean, I think everyone that listens can relate, because everyone has been affected directly, or, a relative or a close friend that would be affected by this. And you can see exactly how many more therapies and how many more drugs and how many more opportunities there are and hope for patients. And if you keep that in mind, like, wherever is your role in the company, if you are working in the manufacturing, working in the IT, that would be your mission, and that would be something that everyone can relate to and work towards that. As you said, the clinical trials now have been already changing a lot in terms of giving hope to patients, giving opportunities for treating certain disease. But there are still, like, a lot of challenges that are today in the clinical trial sectors. We already mentioned the communication problem. What else you would say? What are the biggest challenges right now? And do you think there are any particular disease or therapeutic areas where these challenges are more pronounced? Something that, I mean, in your experience, you have seen that you had to fight more to overcome those challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the hardest is really in clinical trial is in the rare disease, in the oncology space. because it has to do with this. One of the biggest challenges still exists. It doesn't matter if there's efficiencies and so forth, but one of the biggest challenges still exists today is the recruitment process. Without human patients being enrolled in clinical trial using the investigational product, right? There is no advancement because we cannot understand whether or not the drug is efficacious, if it is safe, ultimately, if it has material statistical impact, right? So the biggest problem still exists today is recruitment, and it's extremely challenging in the rare disease state oncology space because you think about this. First of all, it's rare disease because there's not very many people that have this, first of all. So then the numbers to enroll patients is already reduced. In the oncology space itself too, these are a lot of times medically fragile individuals already. These are people that have cancer and they might be already on some kind of treatment already. And a lot of times the standard of care still is chemo, and chemo is very hard on the body, as we know. And so these are patients that are medically fragile. They're already impacted already. And so, and because of these, recruitment issues, because of the fact that there are not very many patients, or it's difficult to recruit for patients that's medically fragile. A lot of companies today, the sponsor companies, or sometimes academia, right? They have to create, obviously clinical trials that encompasses global patients, right? And these are obviously complex trial, and they have a lot of, I would say like a lot of operational logistics you gotta make sure you coordinate, because again, it's not just even the operation piece of it, right? But there's also different regulations. You're in different countries. You're potentially, there's different regulations in different countries. There's obviously, if you're operating in Europe, there are different GDPR guidelines that are potentially more strict, right? And even right now, some of the guidelines surrounding even AI, right? There are actually guidelines right now in place that's being adopted or considered, whereas right now in the United States right now, the AI guidelines, the FDA just proposed guidelines in January, but we have not actually have it at this point approved yet. And so we have to understand that there is a lot of challenges still to right now with the retention. Again, there are still a lot of problems, a lot of challenges, but I also say a lot of opportunities with the recruitment. And one of the biggest challenges, as I mentioned, about recruitment is the fact that they are, as I mentioned, diverse across different countries, across different sites. And when you have that type of complexity, you're also talking about coordinating different systems. For example, medical systems that need to come together to hold different data points, right? Mm-hmm. You also have different, interactions, different requirements. You have a lot of different, potentially going back to this communication, some language barriers that go into this. So recruitment in itself is not something that's going to necessarily go away anytime soon. But I think, Alessio, with technology coming, right, we think that there are going to be some efficiencies gained from that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And definitely, yeah, recruitment and retention are like the most, the biggest challenges, because are the one that limit the most the potentiality of conducting clinical trials. I mean, more than 80% of clinical trials are delayed because they cannot reach their, recruitment target. Sometimes, I mean, they can recruit the patient, but they cannot hold them in the clinical trial because, as you said, you were talking about patients that have a disease that might be limiting, and they cannot afford, even physically, to go to a clinic every day or to go through all the process of a clinical trial. It is very heavy on their body. So also in that terms, like as you say, the technology and the AI, and then we're going to talk a little bit more on this later for sure. But like, it has to have, in my opinion, the ultimate goal of making also in the clinical development the life of patients that want to participate easier. So about, of course, making the process more efficient, making it faster, reducing the burdens, but ultimately it needs it needs to happen because it will make easier for patient to participate and will make it more straightforward to get to the target and to the goals that the company has for that specific drug. It is at the end also a race to market, right? So we have companies that, of course, when they want to, get a drug approved, they want to be the first into market. That will give you a lot of competitive advantages. So it is a win-win situation, no? Because we will make life easier for patients to go into a clinical trial, and we will make also easier the process of getting new drugs for pharma, which, of course, at the end will need to make revenue out of these drugs. But then we'll give more option for those patients, even those that cannot participate in a clinical trial, that will have more innovative therapies and more, effective therapies for their disease. So, I mean, the impact of this new technology is definitely something that needs to be, considered from both hands. And how do you see this, applied in particular for the recruitment and the retention problem?
I think, you brought up a couple really key points there. Like, there is obviously so much what we could do in the area of recruitment, right? That we are bringing on new technology. There is more frameworks. There is more options now that just wasn't available a few years ago. For example, when COVID really threw us into a new era, right? I think in the past, there was still such a focus on, doing site visits actually at the site itself, but with the pandemic itself, we really understand that there has to be new options. And so what you saw during the COVID time was that there was a proliferation of telehealth, right? Telemedicine. You also saw all of a sudden a uptake, not to say it wasn't already advancing already. You saw an uptake on e-consent, right? You saw uptake on e-pro, like wearable, that again, it reduces the need for the patient to come onto sites, especially at the time where there was a lot of safety concerns, obviously, because of the pandemic, right? And so, I mean, the pandemic accelerated, but it really just highlighted the fact that these were technologies that were at time available, but that weren't necessarily adopted yet. But because of the pandemic, it really changed, I think, in a way, the trajectory of some of these technology options, right? Like, for example, telehealth, and then, as I say, wearables, right? And so I think it helps, sponsor companies, or in a lot of cases, sponsor companies, or even at the academia, right, to understand that there are ways of helping with the retention aspect. Because again, too, it's one thing to also recruit a patient, but you got to make sure that you're able to retain them, right? Because if a patient drops out down the road because it's really hard to take, some of the medications, or the procedures, the forms are really complicated to fill out, then they're going to eventually drop out, right? And so one of the aspects of introducing some of these technology is to include some options in that way to prevent, patients from dropping out. So there are these options that are out there right now. One of the things that you also brought out is that indeed, I think a lot of times in the last few years, biotech, pharma, even medical devices, I think unfortunately seems to have like a be mistaken for like in some ways has like a bad rep even. But I think at the end of the day, like one of the things I said is that a lot of us that's working in this industry, we are ultimately driving for the patient. We are trying our very best to create hope through medical products, right? That just weren't available maybe even as simple as 5-10 years ago, right? And I think people in our industry understand this, but outside of industry don't understand that sometimes that this is a business in itself too. In order for us to be able to invest in research and never to able to get it all the way to the end where the drug's approved and then being able to be, picked up at a pharmacy, right? Is that it's a business. We in this industry, on average, spend close to $1 billion. And this is taking it from all the way from research all the way to the commercial where it's approved. It costs close to $1 billion, and it takes sometimes up to 10 years. It could be reduced now, but I would say like this, it is such a heavy investment, whereas I think a lot of industries, they might not, I think at times, be willing to do this. That business model doesn't really make sense, right? If you told, a company, okay, it's going to take maybe 10 years to bring a product that's going to cost close to $1 billion, right? A lot of companies, a lot of industries might not do this. But we're in this space where we are, as I said, we are creating new drugs. And we also have to do it in a way that's also as efficient as possible. So I think one of the trends that have also been emerging is that I've seen some more organizations now where the technology departments now report into a CFO. The CFO tend to have now a much better, I call it, alignment and coordination with some of the technology that's being introduced into the company itself. Because I strongly believe that through technology, right, you could gain some of the operational efficiency. You could bring together some of the data that's sitting in all these different systems that a lot of the smaller, even big companies today are using, right? That collects the data that helps us also have a much better understanding of where there are some opportunities. And some of the data today, right, it helps us with better recruitment, and also it helps us with better also retention. There are a lot of different options out there right now that obviously can do something like that, right? Like you have the traditional, meaning like you have in-house, even CROs looking at data, right? But what we found, some of the better options is that if you have certain technology available with maybe AI built in there, it could help you understand the data set much faster. It helps you spot trends. Like for example, I know like right now, some of the big CROs, I'll just mention one of them because I've worked with one of them and I've seen this product in place. It's the IQVIA. They use a risk-based monitoring tool that allows us to understand where there might be potential problems with certain sites, right, with enrollment, and they're able to spot some of the issues early on. It allows the sponsor company, allows the internal staff, allows the CRO to, in a lot of ways, remediate a lot earlier. So if you spot some potential issues with some of the data sets, right? Like for example, maybe some information is not complete, you can help triage that a little bit earlier and understand what could be the issue there and potentially help triage it so that there isn't a drop in the retention piece.
You touch upon like one of the crucial point of AI and anyway, any of these new technology that are being applied, which are the data. I mean, data are the foundation of this model, these new technologies. The quality of the data is crucial because, of course, the AI models, the predictive AI models, feed on those data, and they make prediction based on the data that you give them. The problem of data is actually something that in the clinical trial sector has been, in my opinion, a little bit hindered also the adoption of AI model, because I mean, in the drug discovery sector, for example, which I have direct experience with, the data tends to be way more standardized because, of course, you talk about protein, drugs, molecules, stuff like that. And that helped a lot, the adoption of AI. I mean, now we're talking about, drugs generated by AIs, AlphaFold with proteins, all these AI models, AI softwares that helps the drug discovery. In drug development, there is not such an equivalent standard, or at least, not one globally recognized. And data from patients are collected in different ways, used in different templates, and that makes it very difficult for AI model to use this data into a predictive model or a predictive tool. And this connect also with what you were saying, that you, that many of the big CRO are building their own AI built on their own data set. There is not a lot of incentive for data sharing. And is this, in your opinion, like something that will change over time, or you will see more than the big company would create their own model based on their own data, or there will be more openness, more collaboration over this that would allow also like small biotech or small CRO to enter the game? Let's put it this way.
Yeah, I have great hope, and I'm gonna base this off of my experience with SaaS software. So, as I mentioned, there are a lot of changes with the technology, right? And one of the big changes, of course, is the adoption of SaaS software, where in the last probably 10 years, you even see some of the smaller companies that are able to afford this type of software now. And again, some of the more common ones from vendors such as like Metadata or like Veeva itself, right? Some of the more common ones, you have them for, CTMS systems, you have them for ETMS systems, you have them for QMS systems. These weren't as affordable potentially, a few years ago, but with some of this, advancement in SaaS software today, right? A lot of the smaller companies can adopt this type of technology. And part of it is because a lot of it is the cost has come down, and also a lot of the vendors are now able to build a lot of the software because there are regulation around it. And so we're able to then in that way be able to bring on this technology that's now more widely adopted across the industry itself. And so to your question, I really am hopeful that some of the bigger companies today, or whether it's CRO or some of the bigger sponsored companies today, they're building their own AI or learning language model. Part of it, I think, is because right now there isn't any approved standardized regulation, guidelines yet at this point. And so a lot of companies that are using this to some extent, they have the onus of having to be their own stewards. So there's the piece of they have to internally be able to create their own data standards, right? Be able to govern the data itself. And so in order for the data and AI, for it to have a useful and meaningful collaboration. And so as a result of this, typically smaller companies aren't able to stand up systems like this, governance like this, or invest in the LLM models like this. And so I think in time, as this, the regulation improve and vendors out there that can build off of that, it will be just similar like the SaaS, where it'll be more prolific and spread out. One thing I would say is this, that some of the main SaaS software right now, they're already incorporating AI in their next enhancement or in future enhancement. This is a strategy that's already prevalent in some of the new releases. And so I think what's going to be happening is that there is going to be a more control adoption of AI through potentially vendors or through smaller companies adopting a standardized governance framework that will allow AI to work in this regulated environment.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Yeah, I mean, at this stage, at least in history, we can still see that the smaller company, and I'm talking as an active member of one of those, are more interested in probably bringing up the innovation. So, like to say, create new models, create new products, because they need to, as you say, like stand up from the crowd in a low regulated space. Whereas in the big company, as you said, it's more about creating an internal template. Even the AI needs to internal standard. Even the AI needs to obey to this internal standard that is created within the company. So I think there is a nice mixture of that, and I hope, as you say, that this would help smaller company to enter into this world and become vendors and become providers for the bigger companies. It seems there is a wider approach in terms of a more welcoming approach in terms of new technology when we talk about AI, but at the same time there is a sort of still mistrust and misconception on using this, in particular when we're talking about healthcare and clinical care, because of course there is a whole ethical concern behind this. And do you see that the new regulation that are coming in place, and you mentioned the FDA that just released the regulation in Europe, we have the EU AI Act that is going to being adopted. I mean,
Yes.
it's already live, but it's still not very clear. How do you see this impacting the mindset of people working with AI? I mean, not working with AI, but they have to accept AI in their workflow. Is going to be more trusted, or it's going to be more limited? How do you see that?
Yeah, I'll say like this. We luckily, as you say, right, have the MHRA that have now regulations as of Q4 2024 last year, right? Yeah. And then, of course, with the FDA that had sent out even comments for the AI framework, right? I think one of the things that will give more assurance to sponsored company, of course, is being able to understand what industry practice is, which is still right now, is still developing right now, right? But also just understanding if there are going to be guidelines in place, right? I think one of the things that people need to know is that there is so much efficiency gained from AI that I don't think it necessarily is going to go away, because as I mentioned, it's already embedded in some of the vendors' software already, or there's a strategy surrounding it already. I don't think it's going to go away because it is much more powerful in terms of a tool than some of the other tools, some of the other technologies that have been available for a while. For example, when we talk about SaaS software itself too, right? Well, a lot of the databases, a lot of these content management systems have a lot of automation built into them already. You think about it, when I first joined in the industry, and even probably you, Alessio, like a lot of us that have been in the industry that have the depth in this industry, is that we've used paper. A lot of it was very manual, right? But with these new software, right, we were able to do things that in the past, you do as data entry, click a button. There's automation behind, that allows you to do things much faster instead of filling out, a couple of different steps. It'll do it for you. Or for example, automation is that in the past, it will take you a long time to generate a form or a report. You could build it, and then the automation will take care of it for you based on a couple of different parameters. So the AI piece of it, it takes it beyond that, obviously, right? Now you have, an intelligence, right? Artificial intelligence that could interact with your data, help you spot, obviously, some trends that perhaps in the past it would take a lot longer for a couple of different individuals, a couple of humans to do something like this, right?
Yeah.
So I think like the mistrust, as you talked about, I think it might stem from the fact that there seems to be this prevalent fear that potentially AI will take away jobs, right? That fear, to some degree, is real because it does take away some jobs, but it creates a lot of new jobs. It takes away a lot of the manual jobs, right? And so when people say they mistrust AI, I think where is that stemming from is that, well, it's changing the way we do things.
Yeah.
And it is changing the way we do things. For example, you think about automation has already changed the way we've done things. Like you don't need so many people doing manual data entry type of work, right? But you need those individuals that now can see the results, right? Of say, and then make better decision. AI is going to allow us to do something like that in a much more efficient way because it'll spot trends. It'll do a lot more things that in the past took more humans to do, right? These are the type of work that I feel are going to be replaced, but there's going to be more opportunities to engage the experts that we are, right, in the industry to do things that are going to be a little bit more high value, such as understanding the data, challenging the data, potentially doing something with the data. Like, for example, if AI spots that there are certain different sites that are indeed not enrolling at, say, at the same speed as some of the other sites, or there's a dip, right? And that it's going to allow someone in the ClinOps space, right, to ask the next question, like, why is that? And can they do something about that?
Absolutely. I mean, about the job, yeah, I agree with you. There is still a fear and a misconception that, people can lose job over it. But I agree with you. Some of the manual job would definitely not go, but will change, and people will need to build new skill. That would be, of course, based on not necessarily being able to code or like, being able to program in actual AI, but being able to interact with those and, making the most out of those and use their skills built over like the manual, let's put it this way, or like the pre-AI way of working into the new AI. I mean, the AI is basically a support and an enhancement of what a human can do, and it will make you save time, will make you identify issues, and will make you work better. And we see how this is important in our field, in the clinical trial field in particular. But yeah, I mean, many of the things that are now being also, and here we are back to the problem of communication. The way that the AI word is communicated, it fueled this concern, it fuels this fear. So I think it's also our responsibility, or like I mean like people that actually work actively in the AI, to make sure that the message is passed through the people that will need to adopt this technology. And here it's more probably about the training, to train those people into using this model or using this new technology. And you have active experience on that. So how do you usually approach this when you have to train other people in using these models or using this new technology?
Yeah, so one of the key things that I've worked on throughout the last 10 plus years now, specifically across all these different departments, as I mentioned, is to help companies launch systems, right, that integrate the people, the process, and the tools itself. Tools meaning like there might be integration and impact to other systems, other software systems, right? And one of the key things that we always have to tell people is that change is constant, but change can be managed because you have to ensure that you take the stakeholders on the journey. One of the things that we always encourage people to add in whenever we're talking about implementing or adopting a brand new technology, right, is to ensure that you do change management early. You tell the people, this is the communication part of it, is tell people why this is needed, right? The what is it obviously is easy because a lot of times you could even, get it from like a demo, right? The why is easy, but you got to also language it in the company's culture, why it's important to the company, why it's important maybe to the department, why, right? And then more importantly, you got to show people early on, right, how it's going to be used in their own department, right? Yeah. Because again, a lot of departments were driving to deliver one aspect, right, in the drug development. And so sometimes we unfortunately have a little bit of a tunnel vision or silo, right? Goals, right? But if you could show them how you could use it, right? For example, like if you're talking about a quality management system, there's going to be ClinOps, there's going to be certain areas, certain steps or certain areas, as I mentioned, that's going to be more of a concern to them, right? So you got to show them like how it could be utilized for them too, to record, say, for example, some of their deviations, right? Or some of their concerns, right? And then obviously in the QA space, right, overall, you got to show them how, like, if they need to pull records, right, across the different areas, like how you could do that as well too, so they could provide oversight, right? If you show people how early on, right, how their needs in their departments, how their day-to-day operational work is going to be reduced, I think it's going to help them understand, like, this tool, this technology is going to improve our work. It's for me. There's value in this. And so the adoption journey is going to be better because there's going to be less resistance because they would understand what's in it for them, right? And so one of the things that we always also emphasize besides change management is that you brought up too, is the training piece. One of the things that I've seen, unfortunately, is that training is usually done right when the system is launched, right? And companies might still, a lot of times create those like 50-page work instructions, or in some cases, maybe like a job aid on how to use the system itself, right? But what ends up really happening is that, what if you are the employee that comes in, say, a year from now, right? And that focus is not that onboarding, that excitement, that buzz during launch time a year ago is just not going to be, available to you. And what you're left with is this 50-page work instruction, or maybe some job aid that's not even up to date, because a lot of these technology, you're making enhancement to them. So things might change where you click a button, right? And so the training does not stay up to date. And it becomes very frustrating when you're a new employee, right? You're expected to do all these different types of things that you're hired for, but a lot of times now our work is done in these computer systems or using these technology tools, right? And you don't necessarily have training to support you in that. And so one of the things I always tell, companies or departments as we're launching these brand new technologies, that please invest in change management, not only from the beginning, right, throughout the journey. And that includes, of course, the training aspect of it until, say, the software is no longer needed and you decommission it.
Yeah. I mean, training, in also like training, not only like the use of the software, but like to change the mindset of the people that need to use it, like that they need to understand the change and make sure that they welcome it. I mean, that is a point that, you're right. Sometimes it is overlooked. And where we're talking about technology, this can be also a problem if we apply this to ClinOps in particular, because we are not usually talking about tech-savvy people, right? I mean, we have people with a background in medicine or like pharma, but I mean, when you have to apply this new technology and they need to understand how they can help, you have to communicate that and train them in a way that they would understand how and why this would help, but without going too much into technical details. And that it's something that, for example, for someone that works actively in this field can be, I wouldn't say frustrating, but limiting, because of course you cannot describe the functionality without describing the the function itself, how does it work? And this can lead to a sort of problem where also the trainer is a little bit frustrated about that. And do you feel like this is also a generational problem with the new generation in ClinOps, even if they are not expected to know a lot about technology, but do you feel like the new generation, or you have seen that the new generation are more welcoming, more open, because they are like the digital born generation? Or
it's interesting that you brought up the fact that of the generation piece. So I do want to address that. I think there is something to be said that, I would speak from my experience that in the past, some of the decision makers, right, that need to use some of the reports or some of the data, they might not always be as tech savvy, right? So there is a heavy reliance on, the data being generated and presented in like dashboards or like PowerPoint presentations, right? And so if they need like sometimes like current information, that's not always readily available because unfortunately, a lot of the data points today are handled by vendors, right? And so in order to get some of the most current data, right, like say every day versus once a week or once a month, those contracts need to be set up originally like that. And so unfortunately, what's happening is that a lot of the data points, right, that decision makers are looking at, right, they might not be able to interact with it because it's been set up in such a way for them to digest in PowerPoints and because also the data, as I said, they sit with a lot of times the CROs, and so it's not readily available. So there's that piece where it's not that they're what's the word here? Resistant to it. It sometimes is access. They don't have access to it, right? So there's that one piece of it. Whereas then there's a second layer, the operation individuals, like sometimes the clinical trial managers, right? They're interacting with a lot of the data itself too, but they're interacting with a lot of different databases, usually on Excel sheets. Again, I'm speaking from personal experience here because I worked at a company where we were trying to build what we call data lakes, which we can then create dashboards more in real time, right, to solve this problem where, as I mentioned to you earlier, we're not being able to access our data in real time. It takes sometimes a week or a month to get the data sets. And so by the time we make a decision, the data is not real or not useful. And so you're trying to bring that in-house and then build the data sets itself too. There's challenges in that too, because you also have to have clinical, the clinical operations staff be able to understand where the data source is coming in. You have also challenges right now where you have a lot of the IT staff, sometimes different, you mentioned this earlier, different CROs, different vendors, they have different ways of standardizing their data sets. And so when the data sets come into what we call like this data lake, data, they're very hard to clean. And so your IT staff is working with your ClinOps, like, well, what does this mean from this CRM versus is this patient? Is this subject? Sometimes it's nomenclature, but sometimes those things really matter because it impacts how you're able to understand the data sets itself too. So there is sometimes, again, now the accessibility to get you the result. And so there is, again, I think some struggle with adoption because you're not always seeing the value because it's very complicated right now to get to that information. The generation that's coming on to our industry right now, I think is very promising because you are interacting with also another technology shift. What we're seeing today is that, as I mentioned earlier, some of the software, right, is a lot cheaper to adopt than just say 10 years ago. And so a lot of companies, even the smaller companies, are now pursuing bringing in some of the data sets back in-house. You see more companies now bringing in this CTMS clinical trial management system. You're seeing them bringing back in the trial management file so that they can collect, understand, interact with those data sets itself. And so you're starting to see a shift where it becomes more accessible. And because it becomes more accessible, right, companies are now expecting, since they brought them in-house, they're expecting staff to now use it. But then also it goes back to this point, there's a need, but there's also now a greater need to train the staff to know how to use the data, to use the systems themselves. And I cannot emphasize how important it is not only to train just the people that are using, but across the board stakeholders. You might need different use for it, but let's train them. If, say, decision makers need to just look at, say, reports, let's train them on that. If you need clinical operations staff to understand how to maybe potentially create like a follow-up query or an action afterwards, show them how to do that within the system itself, because now you're teaching them how to interact with the system and to understand the value behind them. Yeah,
absolutely. And like, I mean, speaking of this, like technology, like AI and predictive data, where do you see them having like the biggest impact in the clinical research? Like which, I mean, of course, it can be used in all the different parts of a clinical trial, but where do you see being used already the most or having the biggest impact already?
I think two different areas, right? One is, I'll speak on it on the clinical protocol. I think there's a lot of efficiencies that could be gained from there, because obviously clinical trials cannot start unless you have a protocol.
Yeah.
And protocols in our space, it really is what you say you're going to do, what the drug is supposed to do. And so it's designed, think of it as it's the documentation of what the clinical trial would be. You cannot start that, obviously, without a lot of the stakeholders coming together. And I think one of the things that traditionally we've found is that there has been so many carryover, right, from, say, the old way of doing things. We have, a lot of times different stakeholders that want their data sets, right? And there's also this traditional protocols are written in such a way that it's very risk averse. You want to make sure you have all your data up front. And so you might carry over some from even previous protocol that might have worked before in the past. And so you're like, okay, let's just include this different data point in here. You have different departments, like say from commercial to regulatory to ClinOps. Everyone wants their data points in there, right? But I think because, again, as I mentioned earlier in our conversation, a lot of times we're driving, right? And it's tunnel vision. And so we want our data points in there, right? But what ends up happening is the traditional way of doing this is that the protocol becomes so bloated, so complex that it really impacts enrollment. It really impacts timelines, right? And so there is really, in a lot of ways, a lot of efficiencies that could be gained from having technology that help evaluate whether or not some of these data points is really impactful, whether it's really necessary. And potentially, do you need to even ask for that in the protocol? Is there a way to obtain that information? Maybe in some of the different systems that are now coming online, and if you're able to bring in that technology together, you might have that in those reports, as I shared earlier. You might have that reports be provided to you, so you don't need to collect it in such a way, in a duplicative manner itself, right? So there's that piece of it, but also it's not even just the protocol writing piece of it too, but potentially amendments. It could help streamline amendments. It might even be able to prevent amendments. People don't realize how impactful amendments are. It's not just making sure the regulatory body approves it. It's not making sure that stakeholders internally or maybe sometimes partners approve of the new amendment itself. There is such major impact to the operations of it. You got to make sure your clinical sites throughout are trained on the amendment. You got to make sure that potentially, your patients need to be informed of this change. There might be some consent that needs to happen depending on the amendment itself too. There's such huge downstream ripple because of the amendment process itself too. I think one of the biggest efficiencies that could be gained is that if there's a tool that can help streamline this. And I actually am speaking from personal experience. I was looking at one point at a previous company, they were creating the clinical protocol that was an umbrella approach with a partner. And it was extremely complicated because you're now coordinating different drugs, different partnership, right? A different partner. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, it's one thing if you're a sponsor company or academia and you want your data points internally. Now you're including a different partner, a different company with their drugs. And so it becomes even more complex, right? And when we were working on evaluating, the lessons learned, a lot of us were like, there really would be some great efficiencies that could be gained if there was a way for us to analyze, or be able to predict whether or not, written like this, if there might be some amendments that could come down the road. Or if there is there a way for us to triage it? And so set up the protocol in a way where it is structured, it is clean, and you can allow the ClinOps team and obviously all the operational pieces, the CROs and different supporting vendors to be able to then go ahead and manage the trial. So that's one piece.
Amendments are like an underestimated problem in the clinical trial setup. As you said, I was reading the other day that at least 60% of clinical trial require at least one amendment, and this caused a delay of 260 days on average on developing the clinical trial. So you can imagine how this then translates into developing the drug and bringing the medicine to the patient. So you're right. There are now models that can help you predict the capability of your clinical trial, your clinical protocol to go smooth without any problem. But definitely that can be an absolute game changer, because once you set up your protocol right and you have used this tool to help you in setting up all the protocols, all the data points you need, then the less you have to go back to it, the more straightforward will be your results. So definitely the important there. I can see definitely an impact, and you mentioned that in identifying patients, like patient demographics, easier. One of the unanswered question of clinical trials is always where are my patients? So the advent of the real world data, real world evidence. So all this information that we can now use to train our model into getting information on okay, which hospital, which site, which region of the word I would use in order to find my patient easier, in order to reduce the burden. And
the other big area, of course, again, I cannot underestimate, and I cannot, in some ways, I'm excited for the ClinOps space itself. I cannot underestimate how much